Hello lovely people! This week I wanted to do a quick little review of some poetry that I read recently, and that is A Guide to Folk Tales in Fragile Dialects by Catherynne M Valente.
Doobie 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 doo. Doobie 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 Sophie vlogs.
I like poetry. I find poetry harder to just read. That's such a stupid thing to say. Especially because I do most of my reading on public transport. Poetry is something I want to sit in like stillness and contemplate upon and all stuff like this, rather than necessarily like read on a bus with loads of people who are like taking their children to school and that sort of thing. Like it's just not like conducive to the reading effect of that. So I tend to like have poetry on the go, like bubbling along under the surface. And my one that I've been reading for the last couple of months has been this one. I really like Catherynne Valente's writing. I've read the Fairyland series, I've read Deathless by her, I really, really liked those. So when I saw there was poetry available, I jumped onto it, and I really, really liked this. Um, my closest point of comparison for this book, to give you like a sense of the feel and the tone and stuff, is if Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber was poetry. That's the sort of vibe that's coming off of this. So the poetry collection is structured in such a way as you sort of have sections. So each section starts with like a case name, if you will. For example, Kale type 7307, The Maiden Who Bled at the Altar. And then you have like a little, like usually a double page that's sort of like this fictionalized folklorist who and is like, this is a type of folk tale, and they give you like a fictional background about how in the lands of blah, oh, the only tales that are told involve two sisters, blah blah blah, or like the tale can only be passed down from sister to sister, or like this whole thing. So you have like so it's sort of split by like themed topic. So you get given like the genus, like the type of folktale you're having, and then there's a bunch of poetry, number of poems that are sort of exploring this theme and exploring this topic, usually drawing upon mythology or like fictional figures that you will have like a passing awareness of, if not like an in-depth knowledge of. Um, so yeah, so it's a really interesting way of structuring it actually, because you get this little like they usually tell you a story example of that type of genus of folktale, and then you get all these poems that sort of, although they're all drawing on the same like genus, they're exploring it in their own different ways and different like relationships to that story and all that sort of thing. So I found that really interesting actually. I feel like I'm going to want to reread this again and just like take a bit more notice, because I don't know, when you read something for the first time, everything is new and you don't really know what to focus on sometimes, I think. Whereas rereading this with just like that little bit like awareness of the full thing, I'd quite like to go back and revisit certain poems and read that little introduction, then read the poem again and just see how that relationship is really played out. I'm doing a lot of this, which is how you can tell I like something, is my hands just are like, ooh, whirring thoughts. Some examples of poems that I particularly liked in this. There is one that is about Helen of Troy, because that's what everyone knows her as, but I personally, because I'm a nerd, like to call her Helen of Sparta. I think I really liked the Helen poem because I find Helen a really interesting figure in mythology. She has such a range to her, and there's such a differing response to her based on who you are and the time you're writing and the tradition of Helen that you ascribe to. And there's one tradition whereby the story goes that Helen herself did not go to Troy, and that instead she was left in Egypt, and an eidolon was in Troy, which is like a shadow version of her and stuff, which was sort of created as a way to like absolve her of any wrongdoing. But in this poem, Valenti's sort of exploring, playing with this idea of the eidolon, but then also Helen's haunted, essentially. She's haunted by Troy, she's haunted by the deaths of Troy, she's haunted by all of these things. And so, I don't know, I found that's a poem that I already want to just immediately reread again, because it had this really interesting relationship with her being haunted and like a new way of looking at this eidolon and how she wishes for an eidolon and all this stuff, which I really liked. A second example I will give you, just to show you some of the variety, is there was this other poem which looks at Sita from the Ramayana, and as if she was the sister of Persephone, and you're being told the poem from Sita's point of view, and it's sort of contrasting these experiences of these two women who were abducted and the different ways that plays out and all of this. Oh, I really liked that one. That was just, you're not automatically always told who the poem is about. So with the Sita one, you are, like, you're getting a little bit of backstories around Mayana. Whereas there's one, for example, that's about Eve, where she's talking about, as the poem goes on, you become aware of the fact that she's talking about Lilith. That's who she's referencing, and that's who she's sort of having these really complex feelings for, and stuff like this. And there's probably loads of poems in here they're probably drawing on things that I don't know about, so I haven't picked up on it. But there's lovely moments within the poems where you've picked up enough clues and then you get a sudden light bulb moment and you're like, oh shit, this is Cinderella, or something. My aim with this video is not to just tell you about all the poems and be like, this happens, and then this happens. My aim is just to sort of like give you a glimpse into why I really liked this. So I think I'm going to stop here. I hope that this has been informative enough. I'm trying to keep it short, trying to keep it concise, trying to keep it like tickling your taste buds. Is that a thing? That feels like a weird thing to say about books. Suffice to say, if you like fairy tales, if you like poetry and books and stuff that play with fairy tales, don't we all love a good fairy tale retelling? But this draws on fairy tales, it draws on mythology, it draws on just like women, like figures of women throughout like popular, like the canon, if you will. And it has that sort of Bloody Chamber-esque way of looking at them and reinterpreting those stories and all of this stuff. Suffice to say, I really liked it, as you can tell, because I've rambled for a bit. Yeah, this was cool. Catherynne Valente has not let me down. She never has. I love all her stuff. She's great. She's a good egg. If you have any poetry recommendations in general for me, that would be really great. I do quite like just having like a little book that I can like dip into every now and then when it's like a nice quiet moment and stuff like that. So any recommendations, always welcome. Other than that, I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will see you next week.